Okay, this is an introduction to a ridiculously long video, which is, if you're looking at the time code, you'll see it's like an hour or something, I don't know. But it's actually a clump of videos that I've made over the course of today and last night about the pornographic imagination, which I've just stuck together rather than load 5 or 6 videos separately. I've just put them all together one after the other. And this is a little introduction, so you don't have to watch the whole lot, you don't have to watch any of them, of course, it's entirely optional. But just so you know what's in store, if you should wish to dip into any of this stuff, I'll just read out what the kinds of things I'm talking about. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll do some of those annotation things around so you can, I think, if I can do it, you can click and go to various places. Video. Yeah, so the whole thing is about the pornographic imagination, this idea I've had for something that I'm calling the pornographic imagination, and the role that it might play in the evolution of. I'm still playing with words here. Still not quite sure how to phrase this, but I've called it consciousness. But I might change it to self, or I might bring in intelligence. Girly Voice sent me a comment, which I might build that in. So I'm still playing with the language exactly. But anyway, it's in 7 parts. God, I haven't got that many. 7 parts here, so I'll just tell you what they are and I'll constellate them around my head so you can watch the whole thing or not. The first part is called something like Do Animals Wank? And this is really about the initial bit of research that I found, which just shows that animals don't masturbate as much as humans. Why is that? And it correlates apparently with animals not being as good at visual and perhaps all the other kinds of fantasies as humans. So I just use that as a jumping off point. So I talk a little bit about that finding and how it might feed into this stuff I'm thinking about, pornographic imagination. The second part, a quite short bit on if the pornographic imagination does exist. If it was an early development, it would only survive over evolutionary time and develop into a contributing factor towards contemporary consciousness or contemporary selfhood if it provided some kind of an evolutionary advantage. So in that bit, just talk a little bit about what evolutionary advantages might be garnered from having an imagination that's good at thinking dirty thoughts. Third part, really coming out of that evolutionary stuff, I needed to think about what kind of initial conditions would have to be in place to produce a kind of mind which can do the things I'm talking about. Because obviously you'd have to have the hardware and the software in place to make that kind of a mind. So I've just given some, again, relatively speculative ideas for what those initial conditions might be. What kinds of evolutionary changes would have to take place in the human body in order to produce, and in the environment, in order to produce the kinds of minds that do the things that I'm suggesting that they do. It's mostly about bipedalism and neuroplasticity, that bit. Okay, then I do a little bit about what do I do there? I think I missed a bit out here actually. What do I do now? I'm sorry, I'm just looking up here. Yeah, I think I do then a section on the bicameral mind, which is this thing of Julian Jaynes, which is the idea that I'm predominantly looking at really. It's just a really simple model. It's not terribly well proven, but it's interesting. And so I talk a bit about Julian Jaynes' model of the bicameral mind, which is the kind of theoretical framework that I'm using to pin other kinds of ideas on. So a little bit about that and some variants on it that I'm speculating about that would, as I say, feed into this idea of a pornographic imagination as one of the drivers for contemporary human consciousness, contemporary human selfhood or intelligence. Then I just spend a couple of minutes just talking about other modular mind models, because obviously Julian Jaynes isn't the only model of how the mind works, and it's probably the least proven of any of them, but it's interesting. So I've just thrown up a couple of other models of how minds might be thought about, modular models, just to add to the richness, really. Then there's a bit of a diversion here. This is my favourite bit, I have to say. I just kind of thought, I just got thinking about, why is masturbation, which is one of the things I talk about quite a lot here. Why is it until recently, and still, for many people, a taboo subject to think about, talk about, and certainly not something you would do. So I just talk a little bit about that, particularly in relation to the Enlightenment, because obviously there's lots of good religious reasons, not good reasons, but there's lots of well-documented religious reasons why people shouldn't crack one off. But, given the Enlightenment, and we're all supposed to be rational, reasonable human beings for the last couple of hundred years, how come it's taken so long to get even the small amounts of approval that it's got? So I just kick around that as an idea and suggest that, even that rational Enlightenment brings its own logic to why masturbating is a bad thing. But they were wrong. They were all wrong. Okay, then I talk about... I'm kind of working my way towards the end here. Then I talk a little bit about this analogy, which I'd like to develop because I think it's fun, about pornography being one of the driving forces for the development of technology, particularly internet technology. As I said in previous video, there's a lot of... we wouldn't have the internet today if it wasn't by the fact that whatever it is, 50% of people are watching porn at any particular moment. I'm not excusing or qualifying or commenting on the status of pornography. I'm just observing it as a driver for technological advancement, and what I just speculate there a little bit about, which I'd like to develop as an analogy, is that porn is also potentially a driver for that other technology, the technology of self, the technology of consciousness, through this bicameral process and breakdown of bicameral processes. But what I want to do there, I don't know if I'll be able to do this, I want to put it alongside other drivers, because the other drivers in terms of particularly internet technology are military applications and games, video games particularly. I mean, those are the technologies which are pushing the thing forward, aren't they, really, alongside economics, I guess. So, I'd really like to be able to use at least particularly the games thing as an analogy as a kind of contrasting or complementary analogy for the development of selfhood consciousness, and if I can, really. And the last bit, which I really want to I've just started thinking about this last couple of hours actually after watching the video yesterday. I want to try and find a way of looping in social media onto this. This is based on a video I watched last night. It's a section I'm calling bicameral media, where I'm just thinking about, okay, so this is the technologies and this is the environment which produces contemporary selfhood, but the environment we live in is changing, and one of the ways it's changing is through social media and media practices like YouTube. And I'm just thinking, what's the relationship between that? Is there a way of looking at media as going through its own breakdown, of a bicameral process? So I talk about that. If you got any feedback, I'd really love to hear it. I know it's a huge video, so I'm not expecting anybody to watch the damn lot, but even if you can feedback on just what you've heard so far, that would be cool. I'll just remind you, if you don't already know, the reason why I'm doing this is not just because it's interesting, although that's good enough reason. It's because I want to put forward a proposal to this conference, which I thought was in China, but it's actually in Stockholm in 2011, a consciousness conference, which I'd really want to go to. I've been wanting to go to it for years, never managed to go. I want to see if I can go, and I thought I'd put something like this proposal together. The deadline for abstracts is tomorrow, the 31st. So I have to cracked off 250, 350 words, or whatever it is, outlining this information that I'm sharing with you here, and I have to put it in such a way that it sounds interesting, whilst also being open enough that I've got some wiggle room to develop it between now and the actual conference go date. So I will try and write that I'll have to write that bit of stuff tomorrow, and I'll post the final version online. But if you want to write it for me, please do. If you've got any thoughts or feedback, that'd be great. Anyhow, thanks very much for your patience. Okay, this thing about the origin of consciousness and the pornographic imagination, where I'm thinking that the key piece of research that I'm propelling through this, and I'm finding different pieces of research to attach to, is I mentioned in a video a couple of days ago about masturbation in animals and in humans, and there are quite distinct differences and what those differences might be down to. And the observation is that animals masturbate very little and humans masturbate a lot. Now, I've done a bit of research since, and it is contested that it's not as solid a piece of research as I hoped it would be. But there does seem to be good evidence that certainly humans do it far more. We also do it far more at all times of the year, and we do it under different conditions. We don't seem to need any kind of visual stimulus to prompt it, or auditory stimulus, or olfactory stimulus to do it. We can just conjure up the mental images to support our autoerotic activity, and off we go. Animals don't seem to be able to do that, and the suggestion is that they can't do that because they're not as good at imagining things. They just can't create that virtual surrogate partner or virtual surrogate experience in their heads, which will allow them to be aroused enough to go through with it. You know, that's the thesis of the article that I've mentioned in the previous video by Jesse Bering. Okay, several things follow from that, don't they? I mean, first thing I would have to do is to find out, obviously, to put together some statistics and some facts about animal masturbation, the stuff I've mentioned already, because it does exist. But as I say, they tend to masturbate, but not, or self-stimulate, but not necessarily to orgasm. That seems to be the most common activity. So I'm not sure if it really counts as masturbation, or more like just scratching your bollocks. It's that kind of thing, really. And they certainly don't do it to the opportunities they could. You know what I mean? I'm not sure I'm not the only bloke who's ever seen a dog licking its bollocks, thinking, "Jesus, if I could do that, I'd never leave the house." You know. So they clearly don't take the opportunities to do it that humans for sure would. I think one of the things I'd have to, as I say, talk a little bit about animal masturbation contrasted with human masturbation, both in terms of its patterns, its frequency, and perhaps the reasons for that, which, as I say in the article that I'm talking about, lie within the ability to fantasize and what I'm referring to as a pornographic imagination, and the creation of a kind of sexual situation or a sexual surrogate in the mind, which for my purposes I'm using as the idea that forms the basis for other kinds of other relationships, which ultimately become internalized into a self relation. So what starts off as I don't know, I can't put it any better than that really. Starts off as a sexual self-other relationship, sets the pattern and template for other kind of self-other relationships, and the idea of a self becomes defined in that self-other relationship. Right, so I'd need to talk about that. I mean, the other thing I'd want to go into, I think, and I'll talk about this in another video, is to do with, because I don't think that's enough. I think the idea of just being able to imagine better than other animals is good, but I don't think that's enough. I think we'd need a secondary mechanism, and probably the mechanism I would go for would be the ability to make images, to externalize representations. Because animals don't do art, do they? They don't make art. So even if they've got a really fantastic imagination, you still don't get animal porn. And to the extent that we do, we are kind of externalizing our imagination, and that allows it to ratchet up and allows it to develop in ways which would not be possible if we couldn't do that. Oops, fallen off the fence. Yeah, that'll do for now. I just want to add something to a video I just made about animals and human masturbation, and how humans have a higher apparent sexual behaviour demonstrated through masturbatory patterns because of their ability to internalise otherness and therefore set up surrogate self-other sexual relationships, which act as masturbatory aids, kind of. But I think it also says in this article that I mentioned that activity doesn't just accompany masturbation. It's not just about thinking dirty thoughts and going to the bathroom with a dirty book and a hanky. It's not that kind of an experience, although that's still part of it. It's really about all human sexual activity, like all human activity of all sorts now, but I would say primarily, with primacy, human sexual activity being simultaneously accompanied by the possibility of fantasy and imagination. I mean, I know there's very good research to demonstrate that people who are engaged in, you know, relatively straightforward sexual behaviour with a partner, sexual intercourse with a male or female partner, a lot of the time people are simultaneously fantasising about another partner. Frighteningly high statistic, if that's the kind of thing that bothers you. Most of the time that someone's in bed with you having sex, they're thinking about somebody, well, maybe not most of the time, they're thinking about somebody else. Often a celebrity, but, you know, often, you know, the woman down the street, or somebody in the office, or somebody on YouTube. You know, it's often that kind of a thing. So that's unfortunate. Or alternatively, they're thinking of, they are thinking of you. You know, they're having sex with you and they are thinking of you, but what they're thinking about is something else, not the thing they're doing at that moment. They're having the hand job, but they're thinking of the blow job. You know, they're experiencing oral, but they're thinking about anal. It's that kind of thing goes on all the time. We don't talk about it terribly much because it's bad manners, isn't it? But it is a pattern of human sexuality, and it's and the reason for it, at least in terms of the kinds of things I'm talking about here, is because we are imaginative animals. Our experience is constantly doubled. We're not just doing the thing we're doing, we're constantly thinking about the thing we're doing. Or the constant thing we're doing is constantly being augmented by either an image of itself or an image of a variant on itself, a subjunctive possibility that's constantly being projected on all of our activities. Sometimes it matches perfectly, in which case there we are, making love to our wives, girlfriends and boyfriends and husbands and lovers. But sometimes, you know, we're with Jennifer Aniston or Brad Pitt, or, I don't know, math fails, who knows. Yes, that'll do. The point is with this porn, actually it's getting really dark, isn't it? You might not be able to see me, hopefully you can hear my voice. But the point is with this pornographic imagination stuff is that it isn't kind of an evolutionary account, it's an evolution of consciousness through the breakdown of the bicameral mind, with that bicameral mind being partially pornographic and driven by a pornography of the imagination, or an erotic imagination, probably better put. It would only work, it would only act as a driver if there was an evolutionary advantage attached to it. So I'd have to at least consider what role sexual fantasy would play, both in its developed form that we have now in terms of its full-blown consciousness, let's say, but also in its nascent forms as I say, just the ability to think dirty thoughts, something like that. Yeah, I mean, I know that, there is good evidence that masturbating to orgasm does improve the quality of semen. You get higher numbers of more viable sperm. If amongst men, of course, it may not apply to women in quite the same way. If you masturbate regularly, so that's good evidence for one thing. But also, I suspect that if, and as I say, if fantasy allows you to do that more often, then you're the one with the good imagination, one, you know, behind the bike sheds wanking, is going to have more kids ultimately, because you have more viable sperm because of the frequency of your masturbatory practice. So there's a kind of Procrustean just so story to tell there. Alternatively, or perhaps in addition to that, the idea of a kind of doubling of consciousness through the imagination, the development of a bicameral mind which could eventually break down into contemporary consciousness, the development of that through an erotic imagination and the fictitious imaginary simulation of another that can act as an erotic virtual partner. I mean, just that in itself is probably a good thing, you know, to be able to improve your imagination and imagine things in more detail and have a more vivid imagination. It's got to be a good thing. I mean, you've got to be a better predictor of life's dangers and life's opportunities if you've got a better imagination. You know, even as a very simple animal, even if you're just something shambling around in the jungle or shuffling across an ice floe somewhere, if you're able to imagine, you know, the killer whale that might come through that hole and eat you alive, or if you're able to imagine in better detail, you know, where that caribou might go to, or the I don't know, the fruiting patterns of this particular plant, if you're better able to simulate that internally, then you're going to have an advantage, aren't you? So it might be a bit of an exaptation, you know, it might be a complex evolution of something that, you know, gets a kick start because it helps you get hard-ons, but ultimately, or wet-ons, is there an equivalent for a hard-on? I don't know, whatever. It might get a kick start because it does that and gets you into the sac more and gets your sperm count up, but it's going to develop, it's going to continue as an exaptation because it also improves your survival possibilities as an imaginative being. People with imaginations survive longer than people with weak imaginations. Yeah. I'm thinking about the origin of consciousness, and this is particularly to do with this idea I've got going right now about the origin of consciousness in what I've referred to in a previous video as the pornographic imagination, which I'll probably start thinking about in terms of a masturbatory imagination, an autoerotic imagination. But I'm thinking about dawn of consciousness, of contemporary modern consciousness, modern human consciousness, to be really specific, modern human consciousness. And if I'm going to make that argument, I think there's a few things I need to set in place. Particularly, I would need to set in place the kind of evolutionary circumstances which would allow that kind of development to come into place. You know, well, it's always speculative, isn't this kind of stuff, but some kind of historical circumstances which would set the scene, as I say. And I don't think I'd need to list them all, just give an example of what kind of situations could arise, just to demonstrate the plausibility. And I think the one I would go for right now, at least, would be to do with the shift to bipedalism, to being upright bipeds, because I think there's a number of interesting perfect storms come together at that point, which allow, at least set the scene, as I say, for the development of a kind of mind which could do the things I want it to do. So okay, so bipedalism, what are these things? Okay, so bipedalism is obviously getting on your hind legs and doing what I'm doing now, and there's various accounts, evolutionary accounts, of why that might be the case. But several things are the consequences of that being the case. Several things follow as a result of us moving from hominids which walk around, hominids, apes anyway, that walk around on all fours, to doing this thing. So there are some consequences. The first consequence is effect on bone structure. We have to take, because of the way we're set up now, all of our weight has to go through our legs. We have to support a spine from the bottom, which is a really hard architectural piece of, or engineering challenge. And that's had all kinds of side effects, you know, including things like lower back pain. But one of the side effects, in terms of how our bodies have remoulded themselves to this activity, is the increase in the thickness and weight of our pelvis. Human pelvises, by comparison to other animals, including other apes, is a much more robust piece of equipment, just because it needs to be to support the weight and to do what it does. And because it's bigger and thicker, it has a much smaller opening in the centre, and the result of that is that in order to pass through that opening, which all of us do at some point during the course of our birth, we can only be a certain size. Babies with huge heads can't get through the gap, and still can't, obviously, but we've only had caesarean sections available for a relatively small amount of time. Most of human history has not included the possibility of caesarean section. So the size of a baby, and the size of a baby's head particularly, is limited by the size of the pelvis through which it has to pass. Okay, now that has a particular effect. What it means is that by comparison to the young of other animals, particularly other primates, human babies are born very underdeveloped, hopeless and helpless, floppy heads, no hair, can't take care of themselves for years, very underdeveloped, which in a sense is a bad thing. You know, if we weren't social animals we'd be fucked, but in terms of what I'm talking about here, it's a positive, because what that means is not only are our bodies and our heads underdeveloped, I mean to the extent where our bones aren't even finished, but our brains aren't finished either, we're born with a lot of what's called neuroplasticity, and that neuroplasticity does continue through life. But the neuroplasticity that baby human brains have is incredible. They're basically unfinished, and the first few months and years of a human baby's life is incredibly active in terms of brain development. Lots of pruning goes on, huge amounts of pruning of old connections being, or unused connections, I shouldn't say old, but unused connections being chopped away and culled, and new connections being reinforced. In a sense, then the baby is writing the software of the world live whilst it's out in the world itself. It's not fully prepared for it the way that many animals are. It doesn't have all those instinctual activities that many animals have. It has to write them live in context. If I can put it another way, it's kind of open source. A baby's brain is almost open source. And it's constantly being patched and updated and rewritten by the environment and by the social world in which it moves, in a way that animal brains just can't be, because they're much more hardwired at birth, because they are born at a later stage of development. And that neuroplasticity, which, as I say, does continue through life, but is particularly there at birth, offers the opportunity for the evolution of a brain in much quicker over time, but also the evolution and the development and the using of novel brain configurations which, in cognitive arrangements, cognitive structures, which would not otherwise be available to an animal, or which would just take an incredible amount of time to evolve, and they would have no reason to evolve, because it is a kind of Lamarckian evolutionary process to the evolution of the brain, the kind of neural Darwinism that goes on in a baby's brain when it's learning things for the first time and picking up the imprint of its environment is acquired characteristics, and evolutionary Darwinian time doesn't allow for that kind of thing. So as I say, yeah, bipedalism has freed up that to give us brains which have the neuroplasticity necessary to develop novel cognitive structures, and you would need that for the kind of thing I'm talking about. The second thing to do with bipedalism, I think, is really obvious. It frees up your hands, and hands, if we're talking about the masturbatory imagination, hands are really useful things. You don't need hands to masturbate. Several animals do auto-stimulate using tree stumps or whatever, other objects in the world, but it's got to be far easier, particularly if you've got an opposable thumb. So it certainly does that. But more crucially, I think, it frees up the hands for other purposes. We have been also called, our early man has been sometimes referred to as Homo faber, man the tool maker. And I think that's not an inconsiderable influence. We've been able to make tools, use our hands to make things out in the world for a long, long time, to outsource our cognitive abilities into the world and to provide extensions for our bodies by making tools. And those tools could be things like autoerotic instruments. There is some evidence that some animals seem to use sticks as masturbatory aids or something like that, certainly stimulation aids, but they are nothing in complexity to what humans have been able to craft with these strange hands that we have. So that's certainly been an advantage, I would say, provided by bipedalism. There would be no butt plugs, and there would be no dildos of any complexity, and certainly no fleshlights or blow-up dolls if we didn't have hands. The other thing about hands, which I think is really important, it kind of relates to this Homo faber, man the tool maker thing, is that some of the tools we use are tools of expression. Ourselves and our ancestors not only make tools to make things with and to make our lives easier, to kill other animals with and so on, or to insert inside ourselves, but also to express ourselves. We make sticks with charcoal, we burn the end of charcoal to scratch on cave walls. We use sticks to make markings in the sand. We use tools for expressive means, and now we use pens and pencils and crayons and typewriters and computers. And we also have carving tools to carve wood and carve stone and forge metal now, and make external representations of those things that were only possible to have internally up to that point. So that allows us to not only use our hands for masturbation purposes, not only to use our hands to make masturbatory aids, but also to kind of outsource our imagination to provide erotic stimulus. We no longer, since the development of this thing, we no longer need to conjure up representations of erotic images to accompany our masturbation now. We can outsource that to the environment. And here I'm looking at Maglio and Kirsch and their theories of epistemic actions, where they do talk about this exact capacity we have. We use our fingers to count. We use pen and paper to jot down telephone numbers, outsourcing our memory. We outsource all kinds of, or offload all kinds of cognitive activity, including the cognitive activity of representations. And from the earliest days, some of that offloaded imagination, some of those representations have been representations of the erotic. The caves in Lascaux and those other caves in southern France and various other sites around the world don't just contain early scratchings, early images of prey animals. They also contain early images of vaginas and of penises and of sexual activity. The early outsourcing of erotic representations. And of course that's a tradition that's continued, for good or ill. Okay. So let me just recap in 2 sentences. What I'm suggesting there is that in order to create the conditions in which the kinds of mind we would need to have modern consciousness, there would need to be very particular biological and social and anatomical conditions. The best candidate I think I've got right now is bipedalism, because bipedalism leads to neuroplasticity, and it also leads to the freeing up of the hands for tool making and for the making of expressive tools for the externalization of representations, what we call pornography. A little bit more on the pornographic or masturbatory imagination as a key player within the dawning of early human consciousness. And what I'd need to do, I think, to set up there is a model of the bicameral mind and then the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And I'm borrowing the term bicameral mind from Julian Jaynes, who wrote a book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, I don't know, sometime in the 80s I think. He's dead now. It is a model that's been widely, well, actually kind of laughed at rather than critiqued, because it's very hard to prove, you know, it's a bit of a just so story. But it has been very kind of fertile in generating discussion. And several people, including Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, have made kind of nodding approval of it. Not in its detail, but in its provision of a kind of solution that we might have to think about if we're going to answer problems of consciousness. Even if it's not right, it's the kind of solution we need. So I kind of like the idea of the bicameral mind, so I just want to spend a few minutes just thinking about that. I mean, bicameral means 2 chambers, that's what bicameral means. It comes from, it's a term usually applied to government or legislature of some kind, referring to governments that have, or legislative bodies that have 2 chambers. In the UK Parliament we have the House of Commons, the House of Lords, similar kind of thing in the US with whatever is Congress and Senate, I think, and different legislative bodies have those kind of arrangements where you know, one of these houses, one of these chambers will discuss a particular topic in camera and in private usually, not necessarily, and then will relay its findings, relay its conclusions to the second chamber, and then, you know, further processing will go on at that second chamber, and it will be made public perhaps in the course of the activities of that second chamber. The bicameral mind uses that. It's the idea that there's a part of the mind which is carrying out all kinds of processing work, and then it delivers the results of that processing to the second chamber, to the other part of the mind, which you might call the conscious part of the mind, and that part does something with it, narrates it, acts upon it, feeds it back, tells somebody else about it, all that kind of stuff goes on. Julian Jaynes comes into that because and it has echoes in other kinds of theories, not phrased quite as starkly as that, but lots of theories to do with conscious, non-conscious, level 1, level 2, conscious and subconscious, lots and lots of different models of that arrangement. But just to stay with Jaynes for a minute, because I think he's most useful in this regard. Come on, you two. Sorry, just in Dalmatian. Is that his idea is the most kind of mechanically clear and historically interesting, because he's talking about that bicameral mind and its subsequent breakdown as moments in the development of consciousness. And what he says is that at some point in history, and this is like relatively recent history, it's like 3,000 years ago, the time of the writing of the Homeric epics and the writing of those, the ancient Greeks really he's talking about, that at that time consciousness was not what we would today call consciousness, or the mind was not what today we would call mind. He was saying at that point the mind was bicameral, it was before the breakdown. We had two separate parts of our mind, one talking to the other part, but then not being kind of fused. It was almost like we were split brain patients of some kind. And he gets this, and as I say, it's been widely sneered at. He gets this from reading, as I say, Homeric epics and these writings, in which he observes that there's, well, one funny thing about it, which is that people seem to hear voices inside their heads, the voices of the gods. That's one thing. That's present. But he also says that what's absent is any kind of sense of self-reflection. There's very little use of the word I, or any kind of narration of what's happening inside the narrator's head. All modern stories, it's kind of do what I'm doing now. They say what you're thinking about. They narrate what's happening inside the protagonist's head. But these don't do that. There's just those two kinds of voices. There's the voices of the gods talking to the narrator, and then there's descriptions of what the narrator does out there in the world and what he can see, which is weird. And what Julian Jaynes takes from that is, alright, you've got a bicameral mind going on here. These are all kind of schizophrenic in a colloquial sense. Their brains, their minds are in two parts. One part, which we might now call non-conscious, is doing some processing the information of the world, turning that into verbal language, because it's very much verbal he's talking about, and and communicating that in the form of an internal voice to the other part of the mind, the conscious part, which does the actions out there in the world. So these characters, and presumably the people who were involved in this, are hearing the voices of the gods inside their heads and then acting upon those words. There's not that little internal loop of self-remembering that we're all doing. Self-reflexive, the remembered present, as Edelman calls it. That's not there. Now it's a hard, impossible theory to test, and as I say, it has been ridiculed, if not critiqued. But fascinating. But because what he says then is, he says that obviously we're not doing it now. Most people don't hear voices inside their heads, or if they do, we treat it as a clinical condition. And I think it's probably disturbing for those people who have. What happens at a certain point, he says, and I think he identifies this with the writing of the epic Gilgamesh, which he says is a kind of turning point in that, and a demonstration of when the mind started to change, and when that bicameral, when those two chambers started to fuse and started to come together, and they started to WikiLeak across one another. He says that at a certain point, that breakdown, that bicameral state has started to break down. So rather than there being completely two different voices, we started to feel ownership of those own internal voices. Rather than hearing the radios inside our heads telling us what to do and then going off and doing it, we've identified with the radio. We become the voice inside our heads. We become the gods' voices, in a sense, and take ownership of the processing of our own unconscious minds. And that's completely different. I mean, to the point where we don't even notice we're doing it. You would say, we all have these internal narratives going on the little whisperings and the talking to ourselves, which obviously I do out loud, but all of us do all the time. And sometimes we pay attention to it, sometimes we don't. But now we own that. It is us. And we don't have a bicameral mind anymore. We have a single chamber, or at least, well, that's not quite true, is it? But of course we still have lots of non-conscious processes going on. But certainly the processes that James is talking about are broken down. So that bit's been fused into a single chamber, and we're identifying with that bit. So that's what he's talking about there. So yeah, what I would want to do with that, if I was going to do this, is look at this thing about talking. Because when Jane's doing this, language is hugely important to his theory. And what the one chamber hears from the other chamber is words. It's the gods talking to them. It's verbal hallucinations, if you like, that the second chamber, the conscious mind, is prey to. These Homeric heroes are enjoying, experiencing verbal hallucinations from their own mind, which they're saying are the gods. But I would want to say, why verbal hallucinations? Why not visual hallucinations? Why not tactile hallucinations? Why not sensory hallucinations which are not verbal? It seems to me like that would be a first step, but certainly a possible first step, or alternative step to the verbal cameral process, bicameral process, so that as early humans, we have this consciousness, and then the consciousness is filled with the imagination of the world. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, so I might have to make a separate video about this. But yes, the world, the consciousness is filled with the imagination of the world as it is. We imagine the world in its reality first, and occasionally we make mistakes. We mistake a shadow for a ghost. We mistake a moving leaf for an animal in a tree. Of course, but generally we imagine the world exactly as it is. There is the second part of our brain, the bicameral non-conscious process, imagining the world for us and presenting the results of that process to consciousness as the world, usually veridical, usually true, usually what we call the real, but occasionally making mistakes. As I say, occasionally making mistakes, and sometimes hallucinating things that aren't there because we're making mistakes, and sometimes perhaps even giving us the ability to deliberately construct hallucinations, to see patterns in the formations of the clouds, or to see patterns in the flames, to gain a little bit of what appears to be control over that hallucinatory imagistic process. And if we can do that, then perhaps we can use that. And it seems to me a good candidate for using that would be the erotic. A good candidate would be the erotic, because those are the things that tend to come out first. The things we recognise in clouds are usually faces first. It might be whales and weasels like in Shakespeare, but usually faces come out first. But you don't have to look for very long before you see a huge dick in the sky, you really don't. And for our ancestors that must have been quite an interesting process, with their abilities to, or perhaps the inevitabilities of the imaginations produced by their desires, produced by the world, not just writing the reality of their experience onto the world, of their consciousness, but writing their desires and controlling them. They can close their eyes and it's still there. Okay. So just to recap and then to close that, Jane's is a bicameral mind based on on verbal hallucinations. You hear the voices of the gods inside your heads, and then with breaking down that process you become the voices inside your heads, and we now have a narrative autobiographical self, modern consciousness. What I'm saying is that paralleling or perhaps preceding that process, or alternative to that process, is something like sensory hallucinations rather than verbal hallucinations. We see and feel and hear things that aren't there, and we see and feel and hear things that are there. And this is our reality, but it's also our hallucinations, it's also our fantasies. And just like porn on the internet, our imaginations very, very, very quickly go to the pornographic. Just want to just add a little bit in the middle here about, again, I'm still on pornographic imagination and the bicameral mind, and what I'm not sure about yet is whether to stick with just with Julian Jaynes, because he's such a clear example of bicameral minds in action, the idea that a mind has kind of two major components, major structures that are in communication with one another, or to throw in a couple of other examples of modularity that I don't know, maybe it'll confuse it or maybe it'll just be interesting. So I'm just kicking around some thoughts about that. I could talk a little bit, I think, about Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind. It's old, but it's seminal, I think, in those kind of ideas. The idea that the mind, which of course feels coherent, is actually a whole lot of different processing units to do with memory, perception, internal monitoring of the body, all this kind of stuff. But they talk to one another, and so mind is a society. So that might be interesting, just in terms of reminding people that that's the paradigm. It's a discursive paradigm, not a unitary paradigm. I could talk about Bernard Baars. He might be interesting. He did global workspace theory, which is a theory of consciousness, which Minsky doesn't really do, which is again this idea that the brain is engaged in various different processes, giving rise to, we can call those processes mind, and one of those processes takes place in what he calls a global workspace, where all this stuff comes together and is made coherent, and it's that coherence which we experience as consciousness. It's not bang on for what I want to do, I don't think, but at least it has this idea of things talking to one another. What I'm particularly interested in, which I'd really like to be able to get in, is Ian McGilchrist, who writes about the divided brain. He's talking about hemisphere difference, which is really old-fashioned idea, or one that's been popularised to death, I suppose I should say, difference between right and left brain. But he talks about it in a really interesting way, particularly in this book called Master and Emissary, I think, or The Master and the Emissary, where he's just kind of assigning different kind of qualities to the right and left brain and what they do, but not in a crude this does language, this does space thing, which you tend to find in more popular science books. And it's written in an interesting way. Some of it is really hard science, a lot of it is proper neuroscience research, but a lot of his examples are coming from the humanities, from literature, and from those kind of things. So it's really interesting like that. And he uses this signal metaphor at the beginning, the master and emissary. He says because we have the right and left brain, we have, and the right brain, he says, is, as we all know, it's very good at doing big picture stuff. It's not interested in details, it's interested in patterns. So it's very good at seeing the big picture. And that's like the master, he says, like the emperor of a huge kingdom. And then you have the left brain, which is really good at the details. And that, he says, is like an emissary, or a vizier, as he says, a person who's sent out to some empire outpost, and is really good at running that bit of the empire on the master's behalf, or the emperor's behalf. But they're very different, you know what I mean? The vizier doesn't have the global oversight that the master has, and the master can't be troubled, or the emperor can't be troubling himself with the day-to-day running of this little bit of the kingdom. So there's a very different kinds of needs going on there. And I think that's potentially quite interesting. I mean, what he goes on to talk about, it's a kind of a critique of post-Enlightenment Western society. He says basically we've given the emissary the keys to the kingdom and allowed him to sack the emperor. So we're all being run by our left brains, basically, is how he's kind of talking about. I wouldn't want to go there, but it's pretty interesting stuff, I think. So I don't know, maybe I'll stick with Julian Jaynes because of its clarity, and because basically he's done all the work for me, and I would just need to take out some of his stuff to do with verbal hallucination and stick in sensory hallucinations, or whether to contextualize it within these other frameworks of I guess kind of dialogic or communicative models of how a self is produced, particularly what happens when they collapse. If instead of the master and the emissary fighting, they somehow manage to just become one person. Yeah, that'll do, I think. The history of masturbation is quite an interesting one, I think, and particularly the history of its censure and its placing as an immoral act, because that's got a long history, and within the kind of deep history of that, it's always associated with the church and with religion, frowned upon. It's still within Roman Catholic doctrine that masturbation is a bad thing and frowned upon as sin of some kind. I think it's in the Catechism. But even with the lessening of religious influence in the world and the dawning of the Enlightenment and rationalism, that censure didn't go away. The idea of it being immoral didn't go away, which you might think it would, but it was kind of recast. Post-Enlightenment, it was recast. In fact, some of the high points of masturbatory condemnation really have been since the Enlightenment. The development of technological aids to prevent people gaining access to their own genitals is all post-Enlightenment. God. And the reasons for that, I think, are quite interesting. And how that switches about, how it comes from, as I say, a moral censure associated with religious doctrine to moral censure associated with rationalism is interesting. And I think it's coming about because of a perceived separation between rationality and the body. Because pre-Enlightenment, and in religious tradition, there was the body, which is the fallen flesh, and then there is the spirit. And things of the flesh, like masturbation or sexual activity outside of very particularly defined circumstances, was frowned upon because they were not of the spirit. And in a way, the Enlightenment stuff recasts that. But in the place of the spirit, it casts the mind and rationality, rationalism, reason. That the body is set against the mind in a kind of Cartesian dualism. And so by accepting the pleasures of the fallen flesh, or the irrational flesh, we are somehow rejecting the rational mind. It's played out across that kind of that playing field, and I think is actually cast as a struggle quite often. A lot of the language and the literature around it, both pre and post-Enlightenment, but particularly post-Enlightenment, is the language of the struggle, of trying to overcome one's baser instincts and to not give in to desire, not to be defeated by the desires and the sins of the flesh, or the desires of the flesh, but rather to struggle against them and to be strong and resolute and determined, and keep your hands outside the bed sheets. It's the language of the struggle, the language of the warfare, that the rational mind is in conflict and combat with the irrational body, and this masturbation activity is one of the scenes where that battle is played out. And so, weirdly and paradoxically, in order for the mind to triumph, in order to beat the meat, you have to stop beating the meat. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get this into this general idea to do with the bicameral mind and the pornographic or masturbatory imagination, but ideally I'd like to be able to talk about games, really, because I'd like to kind of just cross-reference to other understandings of the development of what it is to be human. So I'd want to talk about Homo faber, man the toolmaker somewhere, but I'd also like to talk about Homo ludens, man the game player, which is quite a famous book by Heutzinger, and set of studies by Heutzinger, anthropology kind of stuff, really. And the idea of the game player is that we, one of the things that marks us out as perhaps, if not unique, then at least particularly developed, is the fact that we do play games, quite complex games, and those games require and kind of promote the development of practices and social formations and forms of thinking, which, as I say, self-reinforce and lead to the creation of more complex forms of thinking and more complex social arrangements. That's kind of what games do. And I'd like to put that in for a couple of reasons really. Partly because, well, partly for a joke purposes actually, because I'm sure I can make a joke out of the fact that homo ludens sounds a bit like lewd. But mainly because I've been reading a little bit about pornography and technology, because elsewhere I'd want to just make a reference to how pornography has stimulated and accelerated the development of technologies. That's one of the things an analogy I'd like to draw out, and say that a pornographic imagination has in parallel fashion stimulated and accelerated the development of the imagination, which I think is seminal to modern consciousness. But kind of secondarily to that, I've been reading a little bit about this, and the other big driver for technology, well, several of the drivers. One of the other drivers is obviously economics. Another driver is the military, with things like DARPA being involved in the internet. But also, and increasingly so, it's the development of online gaming, online video game playing, role playing, all that kind of stuff really. So the technology isn't just driven by sex, although that's clearly important. It's also driven by war, money and games. And I think it'd be quite nice if I could find a way just to reference that a wee bit. Obviously it's not a major part of what I'm talking about, because I'm really talking about the sexual practices and the masturbatory imagination, not the ludic or game playing roles of humans. But it'd be nice, I think, to put that as a side issue really, particularly since online games are so important, and there's been such a massive growth in the way that we play games, and the fact that we play games all the time externally to ourselves. Maybe paralleling this thing about the outsourcing or the offloading of the imagination onto the world. This is a study I read somewhere, or it's an idea, not a study really, that pornography allows for the outsourcing and the offloading of imagination. We don't need to conjure up complex erotic images anymore to stimulate ourselves. If that's what we do, which I think is one of the things that marks us as different. We don't do that anymore because we can just 2 clicks of the mouse, and there the image is in front of you in glorious Technicolor. So kind of paralleling that process where those techniques and technologies, the consciousness technologies which I'm suggesting were some of the drivers of what human imagination has become and what human consciousness has become, they're not as important as they used to be. It's not as important to have a fantastic imagination as it used to be, because we are so good at outsourcing that onto the world and just paying for it really. We don't need to think about erotic images anymore. We can just buy them or get them free. And that kind of parallels gaming culture, I think. We don't need to do quite the same kinds of internal game playing, whatever that is, that we used to. We can do it out there in the world. So, I don't know, not quite sure where to go with that yet, but I'd like to say something about that, because I think it's interesting. I certainly do want to talk about that relationship between the pornographic development of technology and the pornographic development of consciousness. I ordered a book from Amazon actually yesterday about that, so I'll have to do a bit of reading on that. Nice down here, look, the ice is pretty much melted. This was completely frozen, I could walk across this last week. Now I wouldn't risk it for the world. Wow, look at that fog. Okay, a little bit more on the pornographic imagination. And what I'd like to be able to do, I guess at the end of talking about this stuff, is to try to bring in something to do with social media, and particularly YouTube, I guess, because that's my main squeeze at the moment. So I'm trying to think, and I guess I'm prompted this by this video I watched yesterday that was recommended to me by Professor Anton, and was recommended to him by Emblem of Being. And it was this video with a bunch of neuroscientists and philosophers on, one of them being Thomas Metzinger, who I really like, who's a very interesting person. And he was talking at the end, it was just in the Q&A, and they were talking about, what the hell were they talking about? Well, various things, but what it is to be a self, what a self is, which is kind of what I'm talking about here, I guess. And then he was speculating about how what we think of as a self is going to change in the future with the onslaught of technology. And he was just mentioning things like attention span, that kind of stuff. A lot of it being quite negative. And then he kind of just suggested that social media, I don't think he used this term, but I think he suggested that social media would again